Hello, welcome back to Choices Chapter 20, where we will be discussing alcohol and its relationship to domestic violence. So, although we're going to focus on alcohol, basically these same concepts can be applied to other drugs as well. So, alcohol is more commonly reported in domestic violence incidents that we see through the Navy. But in the event that substance abuse across the board is also involved in your relationship, you can use these same ideas as well. So when I typically run groups in person, I begin by asking people about the pros and cons of drinking. Why do people drink? What do they get out of it? And what are some of the more negative side effects of alcohol? Here are some typical responses. So on the pro side, we have reduces inhibition. Alcohol makes the occasion more fun, feel energy, feel relaxed, decreased anxiety, feel connected to other people, don't think about problems. Being buzzed feels good. You're more likely to meet someone and talking about real feelings while you're drunk. On the con side, some of the drawbacks of alcohol consumption include getting sloppy and embarrassing yourself, doing things you might regret. You're more likely to get into fights. This could be with strangers or your spouse, poor sleep, hangover, so the physical effects, more likely to fall or get injured. You make bad decisions regarding sex, spend lots of money, you lose things, your wallet, cell phone, and you gain weight and quickly get out of shape the more you drink. So you see that this list is almost the same coin of between the pros and cons, very similar responses, just on the opposite end. So on the pro side, alcohol reduces inhibition, but on the con side, you're more likely to do things you might regret as a result of that loss of inhibition. So let's look a little further at alcohol and why it produces these results. Let's talk about alcohol's effect on the brain. Alcohol is an interesting drug in that it affects the brain in many different ways, and some of those ways are contradictory. So I'm going to talk about a couple of neurotransmitters. These are chemicals in the brain that relate to mood and how they are affected when alcohol is involved. So the first is dopamine. And dopamine is part of the reward center of the brain. It makes you feel good, makes you feel happy, explains that buzzed feeling. With alcohol, there is a rapid release of dopamine. It doesn't give you more dopamine, any more of these feel good neurotransmitters, but it expedites the release of dopamine, which does a couple of things. One is that it makes alcohol very addictive because it's playing on that reward center of the brain. But because alcohol causes dopamine to deplete rapidly, you are likely to see an initial kind of high, which would be that buzz that people describe, followed by, as dopamine depletes, kind of a crash. And that helps to explain why, as the night wears on, that sometimes people get very tired with this depletion of dopamine. Some people get very sad. Some people get very angry. Part of that has to do with the fact that dopamine has been released suddenly and now there is a depletion of it in the system. Another neurotransmitter that is affected is serotonin. Serotonin affects well-being and overall mood stability. So alcohol inhibits serotonin. It blocks serotonin. The effect of that is that it can result in impulsive and aggressive behavior. So you start to see this contradiction. On the one hand, Alcohol is releasing dopamine, these feel-good neurotransmitters. On the other hand, it is restricting serotonin, which affects well-being and mood stability. That's where you see kind of the instability of somebody who is under the influence of alcohol. They might get very happy, they might get very sad, they might get very angry, they might get very tired. There is rapid fluctuation in the brain that's happening as a result of these neurotransmitters being affected. The last one that I'm going to address is called GABA, which stands for something very long and complicated. This neurotransmitter affects calming, a sense of calm in the body. It slows speech, it slows movement, and it slows thinking. When GABA is affected, balance, coordination, and perception are also effective. So this is where you'll see somebody who's highly intoxicated, speaking slowly, slurring their words, having difficulty maintaining their coordination. Thought actually slows down, perception as well. Let's keep going. Alcohol's effect on the brain. You may remember this brain image from chapter 1, bringing it back. Let's talk about some of the overall effects on the brain. Alcohol impairs brain mechanisms that restrain impulsive and aggressive behavior. So that's where you'll see on the pro side of why people drink. They feel less inhibited. They're able to just get up and talk to people, talk to girls that they may not have approached if they were sober, can make jokes, say things they wouldn't do, dance on tabletops, because the impulsive part of the brain is less restrained, which also means that if somebody steps on your foot at a bar, you're more likely to respond to that in an aggressive manner because the aggressive side of the brain is less restrained as well. It also causes people to misjudge social cues and overreact to perceived threats. Another explanation of why bar fights happen and fights at Denny's rarely do. People are misperceiving social cues and overreacting to perceived threats. It also inhibits the ability to evaluate consequences. If I do this, that might happen. As you recall from chapter 1, our whole goal in this class is to activate the prefrontal cortex. This is the higher level portion of the brain that deals with reasoning, executive functioning. It can anticipate consequences to actions. It looks at morality, intuition, attuned communication. This is the part of the brain that's able to problem solve, even in complex problems. Alcohol inhibits this part of the brain, which on the one hand makes it fun, and on the other hand potentially makes alcohol dangerous. So let's talk about how this can apply in a relationship and potentially with domestic violence. Alcohol and domestic violence. There's a strong relationship between domestic violence incidents and alcohol use. It's a relationship, and it's strong, but it's not a causal relationship, which means that alcohol does not cause domestic violence, but as alcohol use increases, the risk of domestic violence also increases together. So overall, about 55% of domestic violence incidents that are reported involve alcohol, which is pretty consistent with what we see in the Navy. And interesting with alcohol is that the perpetrator of domestic violence is likely to be under the influence of alcohol, but also the victim as well. In fact, there's a study that says that the victim may be even more likely than the perpetrator to be under the influence of alcohol. You can probably understand how that works. That that as the victim also is under the influence of alcohol, having the same effect on their brain, the likelihood of misperceiving social events, acting erratically, acting more aggressively happens as well, which does not mean that they caused the incident to happen. But when those factors combine, the likelihood of a domestic violence incident is much, much higher. Some reasons are that with alcohol, there's poor impulse control, misperception of the situation. That's one that I hear very frequently as people describe incidents that happened while alcohol was involved, that there was some kind of an issue that happened and a misperception of the situation, which led to conflict. And then once conflict happened, along with those fluctuating radical changes in mood and lowered inhibition, it results in an escalated conflict. That mood dysregulation and then disregard for consequences. Like, I don't care if I go to jail. You might say that if you're drunk and wake up in jail feeling very differently. Alcohol-involved incidents are more likely to result in injury. Two reasons for this. One is because there's increased aggression, so somebody is more likely to act out more aggressively and use greater force. The other part of this is keeping in mind that alcohol affects things like balance and coordination, depth perception, reaction time, all of the reasons why you don't drive while you're drunk. It means that if anything physical happens, for example, let's say there is a cell phone involved and one person wants to take the other person's cell phone and there's kind of a scuffle over the phone and they go to grab it. Well, somebody who is under the influence of alcohol, who has poor coordination and balance, is more likely to fall, which means that even with a small amount of force, they are more likely to fall and get injured, resulting in injury. Alcohol can be problematic in the relationship, even if there is not a substance abuse problem. So you don't have to be an alcoholic to have an issue with alcohol as it relates to your relationship. And in fact, you could not be a big drinker at all and be out for a birthday or big celebration and drink outside of your normal patterns. And because of the influence of alcohol and perhaps your partner is drinking as well, when an issue comes up, whether that's an actual issue or just somebody's mood dropping, and that results in some type of conflict, the likelihood of that conflict becoming physical, and if it becomes physical, more likely to result in injury, goes up. I see time and time again people who've had an incident and it involved alcohol, but they themselves are not a problematic drinker. You don't have to be a problematic drinker for alcohol to be an issue. Talk about some strategies to reduce risk when it comes to alcohol. The first idea is that if alcohol has been problematic for you, consider treatment. If it's been problematic for your spouse, you can also encourage treatment and be supportive in getting resources. So in the book, there were some questions about alcohol use that helped to give you an idea of whether this is leading to more problematic use, but you probably already know. Alcohol has been an issue, drinking a lot, if it's raised concern from other people, if it's caused issues at work, in your relationship, you probably know. You probably know even if it's not a full-blown issue at this point, but it might be heading towards that, you probably know. So we'll talk in a minute about what you can do in that instance to get some help. The next strategy is to reduce in a couple of ways. Reduce alcohol contents of drinks. So if you're going to drink, be mindful about how much alcohol you're actually consuming. There's a big difference between drinking whiskey versus drinking a light beer. There's even a big difference between drinking a light beer and drinking a hazy IPA with a high alcohol content. So looking at the content of what you're actually drinking, because that is going to only exaggerate all of these effects that we've been discussing. The next is think about reducing the quantity of drinks and the duration of alcohol use. So if you are going to drink and you plan on it, plan on how much you're going to drink and for how long. Because if you start drinking at 10 a.m. watching a game and you plan to just let that go, continue throughout the day, the more hours that are involved, the higher the likelihood of something happening. The next strategy is when it comes to drinking, whether you're on your own or with your spouse, some things to consider. Consider the setting, consider the mood, and consider potential triggers before drinking. Because overall, alcohol will exaggerate someone's existing mood. So if they are already upset, alcohol will further contribute to them being much more upset. Even though, as we've discussed, moods tend to fluctuate, which means they could start off happy, having a lot of fun, and then having that change. But look at potential triggers before you drink. So, for example, if your spouse is very jealous, and that's been an issue in the relationship, if you're thinking about going to a club where there are scantily clad women wall to wall and alcohol involved, that might be an environment that's likely to trigger an issue. And if that issue happens with somebody under the influence of alcohol, the risk of that going south goes up. The next strategy is to have a plan, if you're with your spouse, for how you would deal with conflict if you are drinking. So just as you've had a plan for how to do a timeout, how would you and your spouse address an issue under the influence if you're choosing to drink? How are you going to deal with that? The strategy might be to not engage in the actual problem because, as we have discussed, the problem solving, the executive functioning of the brain, that all that stuff is impaired. So the likelihood that you're going to get into real problem solving under the influences is not very high. So maybe the goal, if a conflict happens, is to be able to acknowledge that there's an issue, acknowledge that you've been drinking, and that maybe this isn't the time to discuss that. If your spouse is the one who's highly intoxicated, the strategy might be to not engage further with a spouse who's intoxicated if they're starting to act aggressively, and to switch your focus over simply to safety. So to make sure that everybody's getting home, it might be to separate safely if you can, so there isn't further escalation, and agree to address whatever issue is at hand in the morning. But having a plan with your spouse, having your spouse on board with this plan is a great way to help mitigate some of this risk. Let's talk about how to get help if you realize that you might actually need it. So if you're a service member, referring to DAPA, you have a point of contact within your command. Your case manager can assist you with this if you don't know how to do it. But the Navy has great treatment resources for alcohol that is afforded to you. That's a benefit that you have. And it's a very different thing to self-refer to DAPA and say, you know what, I'm kind of recognizing that I need some help. Very different than being referred because something bad happened and now you have to go get help. So just being willing and having the courage to step up and recognize that this maybe has been an issue and you don't want it to get worse, because it's a whole lot easier to treat alcohol issues at a lower level than wait until they continue to increase. Another option is Alcoholics Anonymous. So AA programs are in every city of the world. In San Diego, you can call this phone number, you can contact their websites. Any city that you're in will have AA meetings running. They're now running virtually as well as in person. But that could be a step to get some assistance and to do that anonymously if you'd like. The other option in San Diego, we have 211, which is just a resource for all services in San Diego. So if you were to call 211 and ask about alcohol treatment programs, they can direct you to outpatients, inpatient services. Have the option of going through TRICARE, and a spouse also going through TRICARE to see what services can be available for treatment purposes. So again, bottom line is if you kind of know that this is an issue and it's been pointed out to you and it's affecting you, the earlier you decide to just go ahead and get some help, the more likely you're going to have a great outcome and be able to treat this. It takes a lot of courage to do that, and just want to commend anybody who's even thinking about taking that step, and know that you can get support, know that you're not alone. This is a very common issue, and people do recover and do get substantially better with some treatment. All right, let's talk about homework questions for chapter 20. Number 5 will be explain why alcohol increases the risk of a domestic violence incident. Number 6, describe what strategies you could use to reduce risk when it comes to alcohol. So here's where you're going to be honest. If you don't drink, your spouse doesn't drink, this is not an issue for you at all. That's your strategy to reduce risk. If you or your partner or both of you do drink, what steps reasonably would work for you to help mitigate some of that risk? And number 7, this is coming out of the book, why does Dr. Adams suggest that drugs and alcohol should not be used as a timeout? All right, that is chapter 20. And I will see you back here for our final class with videos. And we'll be doing the last 2 chapters on videos, and then I'll be giving you some direction for your final relapse prevention assignments. Congratulations on making it